In April 1893, an Indian lawyer set sail from London to South Africa to represent the cousin of a Muslim merchant who had come under some legal trouble. He was 23 years old and an ardent Indian nationalist who believed strongly in the independence of his country, which had been under British rule for centuries. Upon arriving in South Africa, he was appalled by what he saw. The racial discrimination and segregation, known as apartheid, shook him to his core, but not for the reasons that you might think. Due to the colour of his skin, he was promptly treated by the whites of the nation as beneath them, even getting kicked off a train as a result. It was then that he began to campaign not for an end to apartheid, but a change to it. This lawyer believed that Indians, like whites, deserved to be treated like upper-class citizens, and that blacks deserved to be treated like lower ones. In his diary, he wrote, "It was a gross injustice to seek to place Indians in the same class as the Kafirs, a derogatory term used for black South Africans. Kafirs are as a rule uncivilized, the convicts even more so. They are troublesome, very dirty, and live almost like animals. The reader can easily imagine the plight of the poor Indian thrown into such company." These views, though disgustingly appalling by today's standards, were typical of the average non-black South African at the time, of whom he believed Indians should be a part of. His campaign for civil rights for Indians in South Africa was largely successful, and he managed to unify them into a single political entity under the Natal Indian Congress. It was during this time that his skills at persuasion, public speaking, as well as his revolutionary ideas of peaceful protest were established, all of which he took back with him to India in 1915. It was then that he began to use his newfound skills and principles to campaign for the independence of India from the British Empire, which he would succeed in on August 15, 1947. His name was Mohandas, though you may know him better as Mahatma Gandhi. His views on race have largely been forgotten and lost to history due to Gandhi's role in helping Indians achieve their freedom. However, these views are still extremely pertinent in the minds of many Africans to this day. In 2016, on a university campus in Ghana, a statue of Gandhi was removed after lecturers began a petition citing his racism. The removal and defacement of statues deemed problematic is a song we've become familiar with today, but the question is it right? This issue became extremely troubling to me when it occurred close to home. On the 23rd of June 2020, just 5 days before I'm writing this, the statue of IRA senior officer Sean Russell in Dublin was vandalised with the colours of the rainbow flag. This was done due to Russell's collaboration with Nazi Germany in an attempt to achieve complete Irish freedom and independence. Though not as extreme as removing it completely, it still showed that the growing movement to erase statues of controversial figures from society has become worldwide, though it's become particularly prevalent in the UK with the defacement of the statue of Winston Churchill, as well as the removal of the statue to Edward Colston in Bristol. Even a statue commemorating Sir Robert Peel was vandalised, which, if you've seen my last video on police brutality, you'll realise just how nonsensical that is. This growing movement comes at the behest of the wider Black Lives Matter and anti-racism movement that accelerated after the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. But while I do agree that the protests against police brutality are justified, to an extent, I don't believe that the rabid removal of statues and monuments is. What's happening right now is setting a dangerous precedent that I believe warrants addressing, and to understand why we need to look at the motives. Born on the 2nd of November 1636 in Bristol, England, Edward Colston became an extremely successful merchant and trader, and it is the removal of his statue that has made the most headlines. In 1680, the controversy begins when Colston became a member of the Royal African Company. This company was an English mercantile company, established by the ruling House of Stuart and held a monopoly in gold, silver, ivory, and, most importantly, slaves. During Colston's time in the company from 1680 to 1692, 84,000 Africans were sold into slavery into the Americas, 19,000 of which died on the voyage. Though he left the company in 1692, he continued trading slaves privately until his retirement in 1708. After serving as MP for Bristol from 1710 to 1713, Colston died in 1721 at the age of 84, comfortably in his home. 174 years later, later, in 1895, a statue was erected in his honour in Bristol city centre that stood until its removal in June 2020. However, this statue was not built to commemorate his exploits as a merchant. It was built to commemorate his achievements as a philanthropist. Using the revenue he gained from his years as a merchant, Colston donated untold sums to charity. The amount he gave is unknown, as Colston remained modest about this. However, it's believed that he is responsible for the construction of most of the entire city of Bristol. He supported the establishment of schools, hospitals, almhouses, and churches throughout the country, many of which still stand and are in use to this day, including Colston's Hospital, now called Colston's School, and Queen Elizabeth's Hospital, and that is where the conflict lies. If the statue was built to honour Colston's acts of charity and kindness, should it be removed because of his acts of depravity? And if so, where does it end? Should we shut down Colston's School or Queen Elizabeth's Hospital because they were built with money earned from the slave trade? Although slavery is a morally reprehensible act, you have to remember that this is a relatively modern concept, which is less than 200 years old. There were certainly opponents to slavery in Colston's day, but the vast majority of people were either in favour of it or had little to no opinion. And this is something you must keep in mind when judging historical figures, that modern morality cannot be applied to people who lived centuries ago, or, as in the case of our next figure, even 55 years ago.
We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The defacement of Winston Churchill's statue is one that also broke the headlines. Protesters graffitied the base writing, "Was a racist," along with drawing a hammer and sickle on the side. It's the phrase "was a racist" that warrants the most attention. Churchill's views on race have become a popular talking point in recent years. I would even argue that hating Churchill has become something trendy in today's popular culture. But what were these racist views that people keep referring to? A popular one is his opinions on Indians. In 1943, a huge famine swept the Bengal region of modern-day India and Bangladesh. This was caused by a huge shortage of rice and grain, particularly after the Japanese capture of Rangoon, which cut off all rice imports to India, as well as the fact that a front line now became established in Bengal. When discussing the causes for this famine, Churchill said that the Indians bred like rabbits, and that was the reason why. Many argue that these views of Indians as being rabbits are what caused the famine that killed over 3 million people, but this is not true. Yes, he didn't have a favourable opinion of Indians to say the least, but he never wished to starve them because of it. In fact, on the 8th of October 1943, when addressing his war cabinet, Churchill said, "Every effort must be made, even by the diversion of shipping urgently needed for war purposes, to deal with local shortages." Following this, Churchill made great efforts to relieve the famine, diverting hundreds of thousands of tons of grain and rice from Australia and Ceylon to Bengal. In fact, according to some historians, the Bengal famine would have gone on far longer than it did, if not for the efforts of Winston Churchill. Off the record and under stress, he made those racist remarks, but made every effort to make sure as few people died as he could possibly manage. But there's another reason for the defacement of his statue: his advocacy for the use of chemical weapons. In the famous quote from 1919, Churchill said, "I am strongly in favour of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes," when referring to rebel tribesmen in northwest India and in Iraq. This quote, when read at face value, is disgusting and condemns Churchill as a war criminal, right? The trouble is, this quote is widespread, but the full one isn't. Directly after saying this, he goes on to state, "The morale effect should be so good that the loss of life should be reduced to a minimum. It is not necessary to use only the most deadly gases. Gases can be used which cause great inconvenience and would spread a lively terror, and yet would leave no serious permanent effects on most of those affected." Churchill advocated the use of non-lethal weapons, where most wanted to shell and bomb and kill. As well as this, he also advocated for the use of eugenics, a belief which proposed that only superior races and people, for example whites and non-disabled, should reproduce to produce genetically superior offspring. But this was a privately held belief, and one widespread among society at the time, with huge movements worldwide. By today's standards, Churchill was a racist who compared Indians to rabbits and called Iraqis uncivilized, but that's by today's standards, and it's only by what he said. While holding racist beliefs that were in line with most of those at the time, Churchill also led the free world to victory against a racist tyrant and played a huge role in the destruction of fascism worldwide. To commemorate this victory, a statue was erected in his honour in Parliament Square in 1968 and vandalised in 2020. In other words, it was built for his actions and it was defaced for his words. This seems to be the trend for most of these occurrences, but to understand why we should approach this with caution, we need to look to when the principle of removing historical statues and figures was applied in its extremity.
The great Supreme Commander, Chairman Mao, issued a world-shaking call to us. You should pay attention to state affairs and carry the great proletarian cultural revolution through to the end. With the Red Guards, revolutionary young people as path breakers, the workers, peasants and soldiers are marching forward courageously. The red torrents of the great proletarian cultural revolution are sweeping the country and shaking the whole world. Chairman Mao says, Marxism consists of thousands of truths, but they all boil down to one phrase: it's right to rebel.
The Cultural Revolution began in China in 1966 and lasted for 10 years until 1976. It was a socio-political movement started by Chairman Mao Zedong in a bid to win more power for himself and his radical faction within the Communist Party after his Great Leap Forward failed and starved over 50 million people. The Cultural Revolution was a last-ditch effort to cement Mao's power and legacy in China, as he knew many high-ranking officials wanted to get rid of him. The revolution sought to destroy all old ways of thinking, be they cultural, social, or academic, in order to instill a permanent socialist revolution. Opponents to communism, or to Mao, were targeted through public humiliation, torture, and murder. From August to September in 1966, in just 1 month, 1,772 people were murdered in Beijing alone. This month would become known as Red August. Due to widespread public humiliation by fanatical Maoists, suicide became rampant. From Beijing to Wuhan, to Shanghai, to Nanjing, everyone, everywhere was affected. But the most relevant occurrence during this cultural revolution that relates to today was the Red Guards' destruction of what were known as the Four Olds. These were old customs, culture, habits, and ideas, and Mao wanted to destroy them, believing them to be the main hindrance to China's progression as a communist state. To destroy these Four Olds, the Red Guards ransacked libraries, destroyed monuments, and looted and desecrated religious sites and tombs. The cemetery of Confucius himself was even attacked, and some claim that the body of a Duke Yang Sheng was dug up and hung naked from a nearby tree while the attack was carried out. The Forbidden City, one of the most important World Heritage sites in the world today, was at serious risk of being completely destroyed, if not for the army battalion posted outside by Premier Zhou Enlai with express orders to prevent any damage. By the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, 4,922 of the 6,843 officially designated historical interest sites in Beijing were destroyed. This was a country-wide movement that swept the nation of China with a zealous fervor, targeted at their own history, which they believed was a threat to their new communist way of life. The damage caused by Mao's Cultural Revolution was immense and irreparable. All that it achieved was the destruction of Chinese culture and the domination of the totalitarian Communist Party, which can still be felt to this day. The Cultural Revolution may seem like an extreme example that would never happen in our Western world, which is most likely true. However, it serves as a warning as to what a toxic view of history can do to a civilization. Mao didn't view Chinese history as simply a progression of Chinese culture to be studied and learned from. He viewed it as a threat to the communist way of life, something which had to be destroyed to solidify what he thought was progress. And that brings me back to the point of this video, that removing statues should be met with suspicion, lest we attempt to erase history. If you advocate to remove a statue, or any other site of historical significance, think to yourself why. Why am I doing this? If you want to tear down the statue of someone who our modern values would consider racist, view them in a way that contextualizes their opinions with the consensus of the time. As well as this, also think upon why the statue was built in the first place. Edward Colston was a depraved man man who sold tens of thousands of innocents into slavery, but is also responsible for the education, healthcare, and homes of thousands. The statue to him in Bristol city centre was built to remember this, not his depravity. Churchill said many racist things and held many races that were not white in little regard. However, he also defeated the most evil racist tyrant the world has ever known. The statue to him in Parliament Square was built to remember this, not his racism. Gandhi believed in South African apartheid, and believed for a time that black South Africans were subhuman filth, but he was also a martyr and revolutionary when it came to peaceful protest and non-violent thought that inspired every civil rights activist afterwards, from Nelson Mandela to Martin Luther King. The statue to him in Ghana was built to remember this, not his racism. We build monuments and statues to commemorate what people have done, not who they were. Every historical figure, from Adolf Hitler to Mahatma Gandhi, from Martin Luther King to Edward Colston, from Winston Churchill to King Henry VIII, were all human, with human strengths and human flaws. Some had more flaws than strengths and were considered evil monsters that deserved to be shamed, but most were not. Most were men of their time, with views of their time, and to penalize them for that is unfair. Apply your modern morality to anyone in history, and you'll conclude that they're all evil in some form or another. Think of what morals or opinions you hold now that seem perfectly acceptable. In a century's time, will that still be the case? There's no way to know. The past should be scrutinized, it should be criticized, and it should be learned from. But when you tear down memorials to that past, like a rabid pack of dogs, and shame anyone who disagrees or even just wants to discuss that past, then you prevent that. If a community wants to remove a statue or historical site in a peaceful, respectful, and dignified manner, then they have every right to do so. But when it's done recklessly, without thought or consideration for the consequences of the action, then beware, or you might have another cultural revolution on your hands that could damage society for generations. As George Orwell said in his book 1984, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. We control the present. Let's use that to protect our past and to protect our future."